Yep. Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 10. Wow, that's terrible backlight, but I'm not sorry for it. It's the first time I've had my window open down here in weeks, and I love the fresh air. So, uh, anyways, hope you guys are all doing well. My introductory slide here, Brenter, is a silly wordplay on Brexit. Essentially, we're looking back to a period in history when England went from being a backwater at the edge of the world, as it was in our one of the first readings we had this semester on the city of London, to becoming a dominant global power. So it's a story that involves intrepid, daring escapades by pirates like Francis Drake, whose ship is imagined in this painting, plying the coasts of North America. It also involves deeper involvement with continental conflicts, a reformation that was at first somewhat peaceful, but within a century, in England at least, challenged the very notions of who had a right to rule over whom, and it involved the exploitation of millions of African and the Indian subcontinent souls, Native Americans as well. So the same country that would give us the ideals of classical liberalism, that would coin that term, would also be a key player in the global slave trade. The same country that was key in the development of international law was also key in the imperialist domination of the global south. So the last 500 years of British history are really the opposite of the trajectory the United Kingdom embarked on a couple years ago with the final enactment, or last year with the final enactment of their Brexit plan to leave the European Union. My guess is that in the near future, they're more likely to forge new transnational alliances, even with the EU, than they are likely to descend into medieval Dark Ages era decline. We'll have to wait and see, I guess, though. So, to give you deeper background to this story, we need to start by looking back at some elements of the Protestant Reformation that we've talked about already. So, uh, ay, 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 okay. So you've seen this slide before. You've seen the next couple of slides before, but I want to cover them just slightly differently than we did back in week 8. I briefly introduced the Lutheran Reformation. Then we switched our attention to the New World, India and Africa. So I want to come back to this. We talked briefly about Luther's ideology and the specific things that bothered him. And I think it's cool that so many of you are planning to write your papers on Martin Luther. I'm actually really looking forward to reading your papers. But I want to emphasize now just how effective he was at fanning the flames of people's discontent, both with their anxiety about heaven as well as their contempt with the current earthly or their contemporary earthly political and economic statuses. So one of the methods used by especially by Luther's followers to flame the discontent was the social media of their day, broadsides. Broadsides were political propaganda. They were not meant to promote rational discussion of differences. They're very much like political memes today. They encourage raw emotions and a desire to own your opponent, to one up them, but they don't encourage rational dialogue. I personally get so annoyed by political memes that I see on social media, because they take what should be complicated, intelligent discussion and reduce it to making fun of each other. So these kind of memes, broadsides, were particularly popular in the early 1500s because, the printing press had only been invented in 1480. At least the version that would become prominent over the next century, and the movable type printing press. And, the printing press wasn't particularly popular because most people in Europe were illiterate. But what a broadside does is it's essentially a poster with a wood cutting that can be stamped multiple times. Sometimes they'd be colored in, with usually just a single caption, and these are actual captions from the 1500s. And so, the one literate person in the village could maybe figure out what it said, and if not, people typically got what the point was just from looking at it. So these two are particularly The one on the right is particularly provocative. It's called Where Monks Come From. So, religious monks in the Catholic Church are supposedly the excrement of demons and devils. And then the one on the left, really just uh, puts shame on the church for its practice of indulgences at the time, which many of you are actually planning to write your papers about, which I think is cool. And what I love about it is it's got a little dog that I think kids would have zeroed in on the sad dog. So the results of that kind of polarization, and again, you've seen the following slide already too. Um, the Peasants' War, really inflamed by one of Luther's supporters who he had a difficult relationship with, Thomas Müntzer, caused the deaths of perhaps 100,000 people. It was a short, enormously bloody conflict that would foreshadow so much of what was to come in the next 120 years of almost unending religious conflict in Europe. Remember, too, that this is the same period when Indians were practicing tolerance between Muslims and Hindus, and that tolerance, as we read about last week, didn't last. So it was during this war that Lutheranism became more formally organized, and with this war, other Reformation movements gained prominence too, like Ulrich Zwingli's followers in Switzerland, or the Anabaptists, um, also largely in Switzerland and South Germany at first. So the areas of the world where Protestantism was having the most appeal, typically up here in Northern Europe, was also the areas where political authority was the most confusing. So the same region of the world where the investiture crisis flared, where Jan Hus's movement that I really briefly mentioned gained followers in the previous century, was the epicenter of the broader Protestant Reformation. The Holy Roman Empire, in particular, this hodgepodge of looks like vomit in the middle. It's so confusing, which included Germany, Austria, Bohemia, the Netherlands, and bits of Poland, was a totally confusing mess. No one knew whether the Pope, local princes, or Holy Roman Emperor was in charge of things. We've talked about this before. So at the time of the early Reformation, the Holy Roman Emperor, who was Charles V, um, he was also in this period ruled Spain, the Habsburg Kingdom in Central Europe, the Holy Roman Empire, and virtually all of North and South America. So the conquistadores we talked about in previous weeks were sending their gold and silver to Spain, where that money was funding the armies of the Counter-Reformation. But after the Peasants' War was over, Charles V decided he had more important things to worry about than religious disputes in the heartland of Europe. So in 1526, the Ottoman Empire down here made new moves against Europe. So at the Battle of Mohacs, they conquered Hungary and would hold it for the next century and a half. In order to deal with this threat, Charles V turned his attention to the Ottomans, and until his death was far more interested in fighting against the Ottomans and French. The French, for their part, remained relatively peaceful with the early Reformation. They tolerated Protestants in their midst, while remaining staunchly Catholic and secretly opening up trade relations with the Ottoman Empire in the hopes of undermining their rivals in the Holy Roman Empire. So, in order to have a united front against the Ottomans, Charles V, or Karl V, was willing to temporarily make compromises with the Protestants. One of these compromises was encapsulated in the Peace of Augsburg, and I mentioned 2 weeks ago the Schmalkaldic League of Northern European princes who were fighting on behalf of Protestantism and really to not have to pay as high of taxes to the emperor. Um, so the Peace of Augsburg gave rulers the right to choose the religion of their realm and mandated that these rulers allow minority religions to worship publicly once per year and privately year-round. The caveat was that these minority religions needed to be Christian religions. But this early agreement, the Peace of Augsburg, was the genesis of the idea of the separation of church and state, which might be hard to see given that rulers got to choose the religion of the state, but it at least was the genesis of the idea that your religion could be separate from your government, that state and religion could be separate spheres of endeavor dealing with separate issues. That was an idea that took Europeans centuries to grasp, and the lack of that idea is what made European history so violent. So the Reformation was particularly violent because it wasn't just a conflict between princes, church, and state, but between princes, state, and different churches. So this map here is a useful way to show the confusion of Europe on the eve of the wars of the Reformation. The middle area that looks like a patchwork of, confusing nonsense is the Holy Roman Empire. And it was here that roughly 90 vassal princes vied with the Holy Roman Emperor for independence. Lutheranism, whether they were sincere in their religious devotion or not, gave people a useful tool in resisting the power of the emperor and the pope in Rome. Poland, Lithuania, and Bohemia-Hungary in this map were all unified dynastically, while what's marked as Bohemia-Hungary would be conquered by the Ottomans only 26 years after this map depicts. So confusing-looking maps like this, though, mean confusing politics, and confusing politics are always ripe for conflict. So this really shows that what the next century and a half of European life would be like. So let's switch now. So one of the key turning points in England's engagement with the rest of the world in the 15th century was its Reformation. And I don't mean to imply that England was isolated before. They had just fought a more than 100 years war in France over dynastic claims there in the 14th and 15th centuries. And the subsequent War of the Roses involved significant continental involvement as well. But these were largely dynastic wars of a different variety than the wars for state power that England would engage in by the 16th century, and especially the 17th, when it started to become a rather formidable Atlantic power. Gonick does a good job showing the papal context of Henry VIII's attempt to divorce his first wife, Catherine of Aragon. The general story is that Henry VIII didn't get permission to divorce his wife, so he started a new church. It's partially true, but it gives credit for the founding of the Church of England to Henry VIII in a way that's dismissive of the reformers in England who really saw this odd opportunity as a chance to implement some of their reformist thought. So Richard Hooker and the Archbishop of Canterbury, who I have pictured here, Thomas Cranmer, put together a common book of prayer that melded elements of Calvinism, that I haven't talked about yet, but you've read about it, with Lutheranism, establishing the Church of England. And outside of England, where it's not an official church of state, it's called the Episcopalian Church. So that's a prominent religion in the United States of America. But England's transition to Protestantism wasn't as smooth as many Protestants would have liked. When Henry VIII's son died, Edward VI, um, when Henry VIII died, his son, Edward VI, officially ruled for a few years, but since he was a child, a regency council actually governed England. Edward VI died before coming of age and tried to appoint his cousin, Lady Jane Grey, to be queen. She reigned for 9 days. I think there's a movie about it on Netflix, but was executed after the Privy Council decided instead to appoint Mary I, also a daughter of Henry VIII, to be queen. Mary was a staunch Catholic, and even married to Philip II of Spain. She attempted unsuccessfully to return England to Catholicism. During the course of her reign, Protestants gave her the nickname Bloody Mary for the people she exiled and had executed in her efforts. More radical Protestants, who called themselves Puritans, fled to the Netherlands, where they found religious acceptance during Mary's reign. Some of these same people would be part of the group that would sail to America, to Plymouth Bay in 1620. So when Mary died only after 2 years, she was replaced by her half-sister Elizabeth, who reverted England back to Protestantism. A cousin vied with her for the throne, Mary, Queen of Scots, until Elizabeth later executed her for treason. So you have to remember that when Elizabeth took the throne, Elizabeth I, other institutions of monarchy already had recent experience in governing without a monarch. Elizabeth would work to strengthen these institutions, realizing that her governing would be more powerful if she could delegate large tasks to others. These institutions, especially ones like Parliament, would take on lives of their own in the coming century. But under Elizabeth, the monarchy went from being a person to really being an institution unto itself, which is why some historians refer to this period more broadly as the era of the rise of monarchical states. And we'll talk about this in other places too, especially France. But Elizabeth was also responsible for executing prominent Catholics, just as her half-sister had executed Protestants. During Elizabeth's reign, England became an Atlantic power, first through commissioning pirates like Sir Francis Drake to attack Spanish shipping and openly support the Dutch in their revolt against the Spanish. The Spanish became so annoyed with this that they funded a massive armada to invade England in 1588. Through the misfortunes of bad weather and the fact that the large Spanish ships were not as maneuverable as the small British ones, the Spanish were largely defeated and never set foot on British soil. Many shipwrecked sailors were stranded in Ireland. Overall, England became a serious maritime power under Elizabeth. She strengthened trade relations with Russia, set up the framework for the exploitation of New World riches, starting with cod fishing, then moving on to the fur trade and eventually colonies, and was remembered for pulling England out of the centuries of internecine civil wars over who would be the monarch, and setting up instructions where there was a government that really became representative of the country as a whole. That's not to say there won't be another English Civil War, but for the first time in centuries, there was governmental stability in England, and that set the stage for England's quick rise. Not to make it overly rosy, but stealing resources from others in slavery would be key factors in England's later rise as well. So you've got a good contextual description of Jean Calvin's early teachings in the Gonic reading, but as usual, Gonic makes fun of the content of what Calvin taught. So as a university student, Calvin became convinced that the church needed to be reformed. He was inspired by Luther, but felt that Luther's insistence on people's direct connection with God needed to go a few steps further. If we really were to accept that we could be saved by the grace of God, not through the institutions of a church, then people should humbly accept his will over our own efforts. So this can be made fun of for meaning nothing we do matters, but from a pro-Calvinist perspective, it really just means that good works are a manifestation of our faith and gratitude for saving graces. So it's all about salvation of the soul. So in practice, many early Calvinists could be incredibly austere in thinking any sort of fun undermined faith in God. Uh, Gonick correctly shows the context of some of this while pointing out that this kind of austerity often appealed to successful trades and business people. Calvinism spread in France, the Netherlands, and was a key inspiration for the Church of England and the Puritan offshoot movement that would become critical in the settling of New England. What I love about Gonick's work overall, though, and I need to build up the guy since I voiced so much frustration with, sort of his knee-jerk desire to make fun of everything so frequently. But what I really like is his ability to just expertly, brilliantly tie together broad transnational discourses. I will continue assigning this book for semesters to come because I love his writing, I love his illustrations, and I love his ability to create a holistic global narrative, and think he does a better job than many of the other textbooks I've examined for a significantly lower price, too. So Gonick does a great job tying in the Ottomans as well. In the 1500s, they feature into his story of the Reformation for providing a sort of foil that could ever so briefly unify European armies, whether Catholic or Catholic and Protestant together. I mentioned this briefly in Week 8. In 1526, the Ottomans expanded to their furthest inside Europe, conquering Hungary and laying siege to Vienna in 1529. They were beaten back by a Polish army. They'd be beaten back again by a later Polish army in 1688, which has long been memorialized in Polish national histories. Then they were defeated a century and a half later in their second attempt to take Vienna, upon which the empire slowly began to decline, by most accounts. And we'll read a later account of the Ottoman Empire coming up. So for centuries, the Ottoman Empire it was defined as a sort of cultural other against which Europeans defined themselves. We'll talk more about this othering in coming weeks, but for now, the idea of tyrannical Turks who were lazy, deceitful, oppressive towards women, and overly luxurious came to define ideals that Europeans had about themselves. Europeans were, of course, hardworking, honest, nice to women, and simple in their tastes. These are obviously stereotypes, the kind of stereotypes that underpin the rise and fall of empires. So, not everyone, of course, fell to the hysteria of religious conflict in the 1500s. The French, until the 1560s, agreed to allow Protestants in their midst, and even traded with the Ottoman Empire, somewhat secretly. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was built on a long tradition of tolerance. From the 1100s to the 1500s, this region of Europe was known for underpopulation. Lithuanian and Polish nobles Lithuanian nobles who didn't convert to Christianity until 1387, the last in Europe to do so, welcomed refugees from the rest of Europe for centuries. As feudal obligations in Western and Central Europe became excessive in the 1100s, many peasants went east where feudal obligations were minimal. In Lithuania, people were just desperate for anyone to come. And as Poland fused with Lithuania, they found themselves in a situation of extreme diversity. Lithuania had conquered much of the former Kiev Rus Empire after the Mongols invaded, so it was fused with Russian Orthodox Christians as well as Polish, largely Polish Roman Catholics. Poland was a Roman Catholic realm, but it had the largest Jewish population in the world as well because of all of the Jewish people who had fled intolerance and forced evictions from Western Europe with the increasing anti Judaism of the post Crusades period. So by the 1500s, Protestants were coming or naturally converting in the kingdom as well. So in 1573, at the height of the French Wars of Religion, the rulers of Poland Lithuania issued an Edict of Toleration, which basically said, we who differ in matters of religion will keep the peace in matters of everything else. So in this empire, diversity was tolerated, not so much because the rulers thought it was cool, like Akbar in India did, but because they simply didn't care, which was more like the Ottomans to the south. The Ottomans didn't care either, and they had an incredibly diverse empire. Religious warfare only really occurred in areas where unclear political and dynastic power was mixed with questions of religious sanction. Where this didn't exist, tolerance was not only practice, it made the most logical sense to everyone involved. Unfortunately, between the late 19th century and 1945, this area of the world was plagued by extreme nationalists who made this area rife with ethnic tensions between Germans, Poles, Russians, Belarusians, and Jewish people, and it was the epicenter of the Holocaust. So the diversity that was once the strength of this area of the world is no more, and it can be haunting to visit the empty shtetls and abandoned graveyards of this region today. Okay, on that note, um, here's some bonus questions. And as always, please reach out if you have any questions or concerns. I hope you all have a good week.